Get this trailer park trash out of my sight. Your mother was a 30-year mistake, and you are just an expensive tax deduction." Those were the words of Eleanor Sterling, a woman dripping in a $6,200 Chanel tweed suit, as she interrupted my father's funeral at St. Jude's Cathedral in the heart of downtown Chicago. My name is Cassandra Vance, though the world of the Sterlings only ever knew me as a stain on their pristine reputation. I am 24 years old, and I have just finished my residency as a high-stakes trauma nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where the air smells like industrial-grade antiseptic, and the thin line between life and death is measured in heartbeats and adrenaline. I deal with blood, shattered bones, and the hollow silence of death every single day. But standing there in the cold, vaulted nave of the cathedral, I realized that no medical emergency could ever be as brutal as the calculated slaughter of a person's dignity. But I am getting ahead of myself. Now let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare, to the moment my father, Marcus Sterling, finally lost his battle with the world he had tried to escape. He wasn't supposed to die in a sterile hospital room surrounded by lawyers. He was supposed to be at his workbench, the smell of cedar shavings and wood glue clinging to his flannel shirt. Instead, I found myself standing in the middle of St. Jude's, my hands trembling not from grief, but from the sheer, icy weight of the Sterling family's hatred. The air in the cathedral was heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the damp, metallic tang of a Chicago winter. Every pew was filled with people in charcoal overcoats and silk scarves, individuals who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. I stood by the mahogany casket, which alone cost more than my first 2 years of nursing school, feeling the eyes of the elite boring into the back of my simple, off-the-rack black dress from Target. I wasn't wearing pearls. I didn't have a designer clutch. I had a stethoscope in my bag and a heart that was currently being shredded by the woman standing 3 feet away from me. Eleanor Sterling, my father's stepmother and the matriarch of the Sterling global shipping empire, didn't just speak the words, she spat them. Her voice, refined by decades of finishing schools and gala openings, cut through the hushed murmurs of the mourning crowd like a scalpel. She looked at me with eyes the color of a frozen lake, her skin pulled tight over her cheekbones by a $60,000 facelift that couldn't hide the ugliness underneath. To her, I was the daughter of the woman who ruined her stepson's potential. My mother, Sarah Vance, had been a waitress at a diner in a small town outside of Gary, Indiana. She was a woman who worked double shifts at the Sunrise Cafe to buy me my first set of scrubs, a woman whose hands were calloused and smelled of Lemon Joy dish soap. My father had fallen in love with her when his silver-plated 2018 Mercedes S-Class broke down on a desolate stretch of highway. He never went back to the high-rises of the Gold Coast, and for 20 years, the Sterlings acted as if he had been erased from the family tree. But when the cancer took him, they suddenly cared about his image. They wanted a grand funeral to show their supposed family values, but they didn't want the evidence of his real life standing in the front row. I remember the way the light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting long, bloody streaks of crimson across the marble floor. I looked down at my shoes, a pair of sensible black flats that had seen me through 12-hour shifts in the ER, and I felt a surge of something hotter than anger. It was the same feeling I get when a patient is flatlining and everyone else is panicked. It was clarity. I looked up at Eleanor, whose fingers were adorned with a 4-carat Harry Winston diamond that caught the candlelight, and I didn't blink. I thought about the rent for my studio apartment in Uptown, a modest $1,200 a month that I struggled to pay on a resident's salary, and I thought about how this woman probably spent more on her breakfast mimosas than I spent on groceries in a year. The funeral director, a man in a suit so stiff he looked like he was made of cardboard, tried to intervene, but Eleanor brushed him off with a flick of her manicured wrist. She stepped closer, the scent of her $500 per ounce Creed perfume cloying and suffocating. "You think because Marcus left a will that you belong here," she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "You are a clerical error, Cassandra. A footnote in a ledger that I am going to balance. You have his eyes, but you have her cheap, desperate blood. Don't think for a second that you'll see a dime of the Sterling estate. I have 3 of the best probate attorneys in the city on retainer, and by the time they are done, you'll be back in that trailer park, scrubbing floors just like your mother." The injustice of it felt like a physical blow to the chest, worse than any chest compression I'd ever performed. For 5 years, I had watched my father struggle. When the medical bills started piling up, reaching a staggering $240,000 for his chemotherapy and late-stage palliative care, I reached out to the Sterlings. I sent letters to their corporate office on Wacker Drive. I called the house in Lake Forest. I was met with silence every single time. My father died thinking he was a burden, not knowing that I was working night shifts and weekend rotations just to keep the lights on in our small home. And now, they wanted to claim his body for their social theater while discarding his daughter like a piece of refuse. I shifted my weight, feeling the ache in my lower back that comes from standing for 10 hours straight in a trauma bay. My mind raced through the mechanics of the situation. My father's will, a simple document drafted by a local lawyer in Gary for a flat fee of $500, had named me his sole beneficiary. But Eleanor was right about one thing. She had the power of the Sterling name behind her. Behind her stood my cousins, Liam and Preston, 2 20-something trust fund babies in bespoke Italian suits who had never worked a day in their lives. They were smirking, whispering to each other, likely about the 2024 Porsche 911 Carreras they planned to buy with their next distribution. They looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a black tie gala. The contrast was staggering. My life was defined by the smell of sweat, the sound of monitors beeping in a frantic rhythm, and the sight of families weeping in waiting rooms. Their life was defined by quarterly earnings, seasonal wardrobes from Neiman Marcus, and the calculated cruelty of social standing. Eleanor reached out, her gloved hand almost touching the lapel of my dress. "If you leave now, quietly, I might see to it that your father's debts are settled. If you stay, I will make sure the name Vance is synonymous with fraud in every corner of this city." But I'm getting ahead of myself. You see, Eleanor Sterling didn't know that being a trauma nurse teaches you how to stay calm when everything is falling apart. It teaches you how to look at a wound, no matter how deep, and figure out exactly how to stitch it closed. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I reached into my small purse and pulled out my phone. The screen cracked from a fall in the parking garage last week. I thought about the 2023 midnight black Tesla Model S parked in the VIP spot outside, Eleanor's car, and then I thought about the bus pass in my pocket. The disparity wasn't just about money, it was about the fundamental lack of humanity in the woman standing before me. I looked around the cathedral one last time. I saw the gold leafing on the altar, the intricate wood carvings, and the sea of faces that wouldn't even look me in the eye. They were all part of the same machine. I realized then that my father hadn't been a mistake, and my mother wasn't a tragedy. They were the only real things in a world made of smoke and mirrors. Eleanor's threat about the tax deduction wasn't just an insult. It was a window into how she viewed the entire world. Everything was an asset or a liability. People were just numbers on a balance sheet to be manipulated for the greatest return. As the priest began the service, the deep, mournful tones of the pipe organ vibrating through the floorboards, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was a Vance. I had spent my life learning how to save people who had nothing left. I knew how to survive on cold coffee and 4 hours of sleep. Eleanor Sterling had billions of dollars, but she was bankrupt in every way that mattered. She thought she was winning this encounter, but she had no idea that I had already spent the last 72 hours before the funeral digging through my father's old files at his workshop. I had found a leather-bound ledger, hidden behind a false back in his tool chest, something he had taken from the Sterling offices the day he walked away 20 years ago. The funeral wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening bell. I watched as Eleanor took her seat in the front row, her back straight, her head held high, the very picture of grieving matriarchal grace. She thought she had intimidated me into submission. She thought her $6,000 suit was armor. But in the world of trauma, we know that armor can be pierced with the right amount of pressure. Every person has a breaking point, a hidden weakness, a hemorrhage that can't be stopped. As I sat down in the very back pew, the cold wood pressing against my spine, I whispered a silent promise to my father. I wouldn't just be an expensive tax deduction. I would be the debt that the Sterlings could never afford to pay. Family isn't the name on a skyscraper or the crest on a signet ring. Family is the person who holds your hand while you're taking your last breath in a room that smells like bleach, even when it costs them everything. Eleanor Sterling was about to find out that when you try to bury the truth, you only give it a chance to grow roots. And my roots were deeper than she could ever imagine. This was no longer just a funeral. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would cost her far more than a Chanel suit. It would cost her the one thing she valued more than life itself, her reputation. I felt the cold Chicago wind whistling through the cracks in the cathedral doors. A storm was coming, both outside and within the walls of the Sterling Empire, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. My father, Silas Vance, didn't just run a business. He presided over an empire of steel and ice that dominated the rugged landscape of Alaska, a freight kingdom that felt as permanent as the glaciers. I grew up within the sprawling aromatic walls of a 7,500-square-foot custom cedar lodge nestled on the outskirts of Anchorage, a home where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chugach Mountains, and the air always smelled faintly of expensive wood smoke and distant sea salt. For the first 18 years of my life, I truly believed we were the very definition of old money. A family whose name was etched into the bedrock of the Great North with the permanence of a state monument. But as I stood there in the chilling silence of his wake, looking at the polished mahogany and the sea of mourning faces, I realized that our legacy was built on a foundation of exhaustion and invisible labor that the world chose to ignore. My mother, Miriam, was the true architect of that success. A woman who spent 32 grueling years of her life pouring every ounce of her soul into the Vance Freight Group, often working 14-hour shifts in the frigid air of the main warehouse even while she was 8 months pregnant with me. I have vivid, sharp memories of her coming home at midnight, her hands stained with industrial grease and her back aching from the sheer weight of a dream she was building for a husband who took it all for granted. While she was calculating logistics and navigating the treacherous politics of maritime shipping, my father was sitting in his leather-bound office sipping 25-year-old Macallan, playing the part of the visionary patriarch while she did the heavy lifting in the shadows. However, the most painful part of our family dynamic wasn't just the erasure of my mother's hard work, but the blatant, nauseating worship of my older brother, Hunter. At 31 years old, Hunter was the family's black hole, a gravitational force of entitlement and destruction that consumed everything in its path without ever offering a single watt of light in return. My father constantly referred to him as the heir apparent, a title that felt like a slap in the face every time it was uttered over our Sunday dinners of prime rib and vintage Bordeaux. Hunter didn't just spend money, he incinerated it with a casual, bored indifference that made my blood boil in my veins. I watched him crash a $90,000 frozen blue Porsche Taycan into a concrete pylon less than 3 weeks after he got the keys, only for my father to laugh it off as a rite of passage while he signed the insurance paperwork and ordered a newer, faster model the very next morning. Hunter would fly to New York or London on a whim, charging $5,000 a plate dinners at Per Se or 11 Madison Park to the company credit card without a second thought, justifying it as networking while he staggered home in a haze of expensive gin and unearned confidence. He moved through the world with the reckless certainty of a man who knew he would never have to pay for his own mistakes, a gilded prince whose throne was built on the backs of people he didn't even recognize as human. In stark contrast to Hunter's life of decadent waste, I was the daughter who existed in the periphery, the one who was expected to be grateful for the crumbs that fell from the Sterling or Vance table. While Hunter was draped in bespoke Italian wool and driving cars that cost more than a suburban house, I was wearing hand-me-down scrubs that I'd bought from a retiring nurse for $20 just to save every spare penny for medical school. I remember the scratchy texture of those faded blue uniforms, the way they never quite fit my frame, and the smell of industrial laundry detergent that seemed to cling to my skin no matter how many times I showered. My father would look at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if my ambition to become a trauma nurse and eventually a surgeon was a quaint little hobby that distracted from the real business of the family. He never offered to pay for my tuition, nor did he offer to cover the cost of my textbooks, which frequently ran into the thousands of dollars for a single semester. Instead, he would tell me that character is built through struggle, a lecture he delivered while wearing a $12,000 Patek Philippe Nautilus on his wrist. It was a masterclass in hypocrisy, a silent demand that I stay small and quiet while my brother was groomed to inherit the kingdom he was actively trying to destroy with his incompetence. The lodge where we lived was a masterpiece of architectural arrogance, featuring hand-hewn logs and a kitchen outfitted with professional-grade sub-zero appliances that were rarely used by anyone other than the catering staff my father hired for his frequent political fundraisers. I spent my teenage years in that house feeling like a ghost, haunting a museum of someone else's triumphs. I would sit in the library, surrounded by first-edition books that nobody ever read, and study my anatomy flashcards by the light of a fire that cost $50 in premium birchwood just to keep burning for an hour. I learned early on that in the Vance family, your worth was measured by how much you could add to the brand or how much you could be utilized as a strategic asset. Hunter was the legacy, the tall, handsome face of the next generation who could shake hands at the Anchorage Petroleum Club and pretend he knew the difference between a balance sheet and a grocery list. I was just the girl who wanted to touch the blood and the mess of the real world, a choice that my father viewed as a betrayal of our supposed class. He didn't understand that I didn't want the gold leaf or the cedar beams. I wanted the autonomy that came with knowing I could save a life when the machines started flatlining. The financial disparity was a constant, low-frequency hum of resentment that played in the background of our lives like a broken record. I recall one specific evening when Hunter came home bragging about a $12,000 watch he'd bought on a whim during a layover in Dubai, laughing about how he'd probably lose it in a week. That same night, I was sitting at the kitchen island, meticulously counting out my tips from a double shift I'd picked up at a local diner, trying to see if I had enough to cover the entrance fee for my nursing boards and a new pair of compression socks. My mother saw me and tried to slide a $100 bill across the counter, her eyes darting toward the hallway to make sure my father wasn't watching. She shouldn't have had to hide her generosity toward her own daughter in a house that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue, but that was the reality of the Vance household. My father controlled the purse strings with a grip of iron, ensuring that every cent went toward maintaining the illusion of our perfection or cleaning up Hunter's latest legal mess. Whether it was a quiet settlement for a noise complaint at a luxury hotel or the exorbitant fees for a private tutor who eventually quit because Hunter refused to show up for sessions, the money flowed out of the family coffers like water through a sieve, but only in the direction of the golden sun. Living in Alaska adds a layer of isolation to that kind of family dysfunction. The winters are long, dark, and suffocating, much like the expectations placed upon me. When the sun would set at 3 p.m. and the snow would pile up against the cedar siding of the lodge, the tension inside would become almost physical. We would sit in the great room, the vaulted ceilings echoing with the sound of my father's booming voice as he coached Hunter on the finer points of corporate takeovers, while my mother sat silently in the corner, her fingers twitching as if she were still counting freight crates in her head. She was the one who knew the names of all the longshoremen, the one who knew which cranes were prone to freezing in sub-zero temperatures, and the one who understood the razor-thin margins of the shipping industry. Yet, at the dinner table, she was treated as a decorative piece of furniture, a loyal wife whose only job was to nod and smile while her husband and son discussed the future of a company she had practically birthed. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, watching the woman who did everything be treated as if she had done nothing, all while the boy who did nothing was treated as if he were the savior of the family name. But I'm getting ahead of myself. because the true depth of the injustice didn't hit me until I realized that my father's favoritism wasn't just a character flaw. It was a strategic choice to ensure that the power stayed in the hands of someone he could control. He knew that I was too smart, too observant, and too much like my mother to be a puppet. He needed Hunter's weakness because weakness is easy to manipulate. Hunter's debts, his scandals, and his constant need for validation made him the perfect vessel for my father's continued shadow reign. I, on the other hand, was a liability because I was building a life that didn't require his permission. Every hour I spent in the trauma ward, every patient I stabilized, and every certification I earned was a brick in a wall I was building between myself and the toxic legacy of the Vance name. I didn't need a Porsche or a $5,000 dinner to feel significant. I needed the weight of a heavy trauma bag in my hand and the knowledge that I had earned my place in the world through sweat and competence rather than birthright and a trust fund. The lodge stands now as a monument to those years of quiet endurance, its cedar walls soaked in the memories of a daughter who was looked past and a mother who was worked to the bone. Looking back, I can see the exact moments when the cracks began to form, the times when the high-gloss finish of our old money life started to peel away to reveal the rot underneath. It was in the way my father would look at the company's quarterly reports, which were always dipping because of Hunter's consulting fees, and then turn around and tell me that he couldn't help me with my medical school deposit because the markets were volatile. It was in the way my brother would smirk at me while he poured a glass of wine that cost more than my monthly car insurance, asking me if I'd finally learned how to empty a bedpan. They thought they were the masters of the universe, protected by their lodge and their freight ships and their expensive suits, but they forgot the most basic rule of survival in the wilderness. The things that are built on lies are always the first to collapse when the storm finally hits. And believe me, the storm that was coming for the Vance family was one that no amount of money could ever hold back. The betrayal did not come as a gradual realization or a slow-fading light. It hit with the violent, synchronized precision of a guillotine blade at exactly 2:45 p.m. inside the stifling, mahogany-paneled confines of the Sterling family's primary legal chambers on the 44th floor of the Willis Tower. I remember the clock on the wall, a minimalist Patek Philippe wall piece that probably cost more than my entire 4-year nursing degree, ticking with a cold, mechanical indifference as we gathered around a table carved from a single slab of ancient, dark walnut. My mother, Miriam, sat beside me, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned the color of bleached bone, her breathing shallow and ragged as if the very oxygen in the room had been rationed for the elite. Opposite us sat Eleanor Sterling, looking every bit the predatory monarch in a monochromatic ensemble of charcoal silk, her face a mask of practiced aristocratic boredom that hid a soul made of sharpened flint. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating, spicy sweet scent of her $400 Tom Ford Black Orchid perfume, a fragrance that felt like a physical assault on my senses, clogging my throat and making my stomach churn with a primal sense of danger. The senior partner of the firm, a man named Alistair Thorne, whose skin looked like expensive parchment stretched over a skull, cleared his throat and adjusted his silver-rimmed spectacles before sliding a single, terrifyingly thin folder across the polished surface of the table toward us. With a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone, he began to read the words that would effectively erase the last 25 years of our lives as if they were nothing more than a clerical error in a ledger. Eleanor didn't just produce a document, she unveiled a weapon, a certified divorce decree dated October 12, 1998, a piece of paper that proved my parents' marriage had been legally dissolved in a quiet, offshore jurisdiction before I was even old enough to attend kindergarten. The room seemed to tilt on its axis as the implications settled into my brain like lead, the realization that my father, Silas Vance, had lived a double life of such profound deception that he had allowed my mother to believe she was a wife and a partner while legally keeping her at the distance of a stranger. My mother's entire identity, the 32 years of 14-hour shifts, the blood and sweat she had poured into the Vance freight empire, and the very foundation of her dignity, was incinerated in a single sentence of legal jargon. The cruelty of the moment intensified as Alistair Thorne moved on to the reading of the revised will, a document that had been updated a mere 6 months before my father's final breath, a time when he was supposedly at his most vulnerable and most grateful for my mother's bedside care. The new terms were a masterpiece of economic slaughter, leaving a staggering 95% of the $40 million sterling Vance estate, including the controlling interest in the freight lines and the deed to the Cedar Lodge in Alaska, directly to Eleanor Sterling. The remaining 5% was tied up in restrictive trusts that we wouldn't be able to touch for decades, effectively leaving us destitute while surrounded by the wealth we had helped create. I looked over at my brother, Hunter, expecting to see the same shock and outrage that was currently vibrating through my own marrow, but instead, I witnessed a transformation that was more horrifying than the betrayal itself. Hunter didn't even blink. His face didn't register a flicker of surprise or a shadow of grief for the mother who had raised him or the sister who had shielded him from our father's rages. With a calculated feline grace, Hunter stood up from his leather chair, smoothed the lapels of his $3,000 Brioni suit, and walked around the table with the steady gait of a man who had finally arrived at his true destination. He didn't look at me, and he certainly didn't look at our mother as she began to tremble with the force of a silent, heartbreaking sob. Instead, he approached Eleanor, took her gloved hand in his with a sickening display of fealty, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles while a cold, triumphant smile spread across his lips. "I always knew I belonged with the real winners," he said, his voice devoid of the slurring, drunken arrogance I was used to and replaced with a sharp, predatory clarity that made my skin crawl. In that moment, I realized that the black hole of our family hadn't just been consuming money. He had been negotiating his soul, trading his loyalty to his own blood for a seat at the table of the woman who had spent decades trying to destroy us. He wasn't the victim of our father's favoritism. He was a willing apprentice in the art of the sterling betrayal, a parasite that had finally found a host with a larger bank account. The sound that followed was one I will never forget. The dull, heavy thud of my mother's body as she collapsed onto the pristine white Italian marble floor of the lawyer's office. It wasn't a graceful faint like you see in the movies. It was the sound of a woman whose internal structure had finally given way under the weight of an impossible injustice. Her head hit the stone with a sickening crack, and for a second, my training as a trauma nurse took over, my heart rate spiking as I dropped to my knees beside her, checking for a pulse while the smell of that Tom Ford perfume seemed to intensify, mocking our misery. I looked up at Eleanor and Hunter from the floor, my hands hovering over my mother's pale, unresponsive face, and I saw them looking down at us with the same detached curiosity one might afford to an interesting specimen of roadkill. Eleanor took a slow sip of her sparkling mineral water from a crystal glass, the condensation dripping onto the table, and she didn't offer a word of comfort or a call for medical assistance. She simply watched, her eyes cold and predatory, savoring the spectacle of our total and utter ruin in the very heart of the empire we had built. I felt a roar of white-hot fury beginning to build in the pit of my stomach, a heat that burned through the icy shock of the divorce decree and the will. I looked at the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked in the garage downstairs, a vehicle I knew was now technically Eleanor's, and then back at my mother, whose simple silver wedding ring, a ring that was now legally a lie, glowed dimly in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the office. The technical specifications of our life were being rewritten in real time by a woman who hadn't stepped foot in a warehouse in 30 years, and a brother who couldn't tell the difference between a freight manifest and a cocktail menu. The $40 million wasn't just a number. It was the quantified value of my mother's life, her youth, and her sanity, and it was being handed over to a woman who viewed us as nothing more than an expensive tax deduction to be liquidated and forgotten. As I pressed 2 fingers against my mother's carotid artery, feeling the thready, rapid beat of a heart that was currently shattering, I looked Hunter in the eye and saw nothing but a hollowed-out version of the brother I had once tried to protect. He was already discussing the logistics of the estate transfer with Alistair Thorne, his voice casual and light, as if they were talking about a golf handicap, rather than the systematic theft of a woman's entire existence. The legal fees for this single meeting would likely cost more than my entire annual salary at Northwestern Memorial, a fact that tasted like copper in my mouth. I realized then that the Sterlings and the new version of Hunter didn't just want the money. They wanted the satisfaction of the kill. They wanted to see the trailer park trash crawl back to the gutter, stripped of the Vance name and the Vance legacy, leaving them to enjoy the spoils of a war they hadn't even fought. I leaned down and whispered into my mother's ear, ignoring the stares of the ghouls above us, promising her that this was not how the story ended. I had been trained to work in the chaotic, blood-soaked environment of a Level 1 trauma center, where the difference between a survivor and a corpse is often nothing more than the will to keep breathing when the pain becomes unbearable. Eleanor Sterling thought she had won because she had the paper and the lawyers and the $40 million, but she forgot that I was the one who knew how to handle a crisis. I was the one who knew the secrets hidden in my father's old cedar workshop in Alaska, the ledger that wasn't included in the 32 boxes of evidence Alistair Thorne had cataloged. If they wanted a war of signatures and decrees, I would give them one, but I would also bring the grit and the survival instincts of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the high-altitude ventilation system and the soft, rhythmic sobbing of the woman on the floor. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking but my gaze fixed on Eleanor, refusing to look away until she was the one who blinked. I didn't need her perfume, and I didn't need her silk suits. I had the truth of 32 years of labor and the cold, hard resolve of a nurse who had seen far worse things than a greedy socialite. As I began the process of lifting my mother's limp form, preparing to carry her out of that den of thieves and into a world where we had nothing left but our names, I felt the first shift in the atmosphere, the subtle realization that while they had taken the money, they had failed to take our fire. Family isn't the person who signs the checks or the one who kisses the hand of the victor. Family is the one who stays on the floor with you when the world turns to marble and ice, and I was going to make sure the Sterlings learned exactly how much that loyalty was worth, down to the very last cent. I sat in the driver's seat of my 2015 silver metallic Honda Civic at 4:12 a.m., the interior of the car illuminated only by the ghostly, flickering blue light of my laptop screen and the rhythmic amber flash of a broken streetlight overhead. Outside, a relentless Chicago rain was hammering against the thin glass and the dented roof of the car, creating a suffocating, percussive roar that matched the frantic pounding in my chest. This parking lot, a cracked and oil-stained expanse of asphalt behind a 24-hour Dunkin' on the outskirts of the city, was miles away from the vaulted ceilings of St. Jude's or the marble-clad treachery of the Sterling legal offices, yet it felt like the only honest place left in the world. I checked my mobile banking app, the screen glaring back at me with the cold, unblinking reality of my situation. I had exactly $1,240 in my savings account, a pittance that was supposed to last until my next paycheck, and a mountain of student debt totaling $186,000 from my years of grinding through nursing school and clinical rotations. In the eyes of the Sterlings, I was a rounding error, a minor inconvenience to be swept away by their high-priced attorneys and their $40 million inheritance. But as I looked at the folder on my desktop labeled Legacy, I realized they had made the most fatal mistake possible in a war of attrition. They had underestimated the person who understood the plumbing of their empire. My father, Silas Vance, had always prided himself on being the visionary, the man who saw the grand patterns of the Alaskan shipping lanes and the global freight markets. But he was a man who lived in the clouds while my mother, Miriam, lived in the ledgers. For 32 years, she had been the one who actually kept the wheels turning, managing the grit and the grime of the Vance Freight Group, while Silas played the part of the refined patriarch. What the Sterlings didn't know what even my brother Hunter was too arrogant to notice was that my mother was a woman who believed in insurance policies that weren't written by brokers. I had spent the last 3 hours meticulously scrolling through the legacy folder, which contained high-resolution digital copies of every shipping manifest, internal audit, and private communication from the last decade of the company's operations. These were files my mother had quietly scanned and encrypted over years of 14-hour shifts, a digital breadcrumb trail that led directly into the dark heart of the Sterling Vance fortune. As I opened a spreadsheet titled Project North Star, the true scale of the betrayal began to crystallize in the freezing air of my car, the scent of stale coffee and old upholstery suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of an impending explosion. My father hadn't just legally dissolved his marriage to my mother to keep his assets separate. He had spent 26 years systematically committing federal tax fraud on a scale that would make a forensic accountant's blood run cold. The manifests didn't match the tax filings I had found in the public records of the Sterling Global filings. There were ghost shipments of heavy machinery through the port of Anchorage that appeared on the internal logs, but vanished from the official revenue reports submitted to the IRS. I saw offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg, linked not to the company directly, but to private shell corporations that listed Eleanor Sterling as the primary beneficiary and my father as the silent guarantor. He had been hiding assets from the government for over 2 decades, using my mother's hard work as a shield and the Vance Freight Group as a massive industrial-grade money laundry. The divorce decree from 1998 wasn't just a way to disinherit me and my mother. It was a strategic move to ensure that if the house of cards ever collapsed, the liability would fall on the mistake of his first life, while the Sterling name remained pristine and untouched by the filth of his financial crimes. The realization hit me with the force of a cardiac arrest. My father didn't just abandon us. He had used us as human collateral for his greed. Every time I had asked for help with my tuition and been told that the markets were volatile, he was actually busy moving 6-figure sums into hidden accounts to avoid the 21% corporate tax rate. Every time my mother had stayed late to fix a logistics nightmare, she was unknowingly providing the cover story for a fraudulent tax deduction that saved the Sterlings millions of dollars. I looked at a specific entry from 2018, the year Hunter crashed the $90,000 Porsche Taycan, and saw a corresponding equipment loss write-off in the Vance freight books for exactly $95,000, a blatant fabrication that turned a spoiled son's recklessness into a government-subsidized gift. The sheer, calculated audacity of it was staggering. They thought they were the real winners because they had the money, but they had forgotten that money leaves a trail of digital footprints that no amount of Chanel or Tom Ford perfume can ever fully mask. I leaned back against the headrest, the plastic of the seat creaking under my weight, and watched the rain wash over the windshield in thick, distorted sheets. The 2015 Honda Civic felt like a fortress now, a humble, reliable vessel compared to the sinking ship of the Sterling Empire. I thought about Eleanor Sterling's $6,000 suit and the way she had looked down at my mother on that marble floor, and a cold, clinical calm began to settle over me, the same focus I feel when I'm holding a 10-blade scalpel and waiting for the lead surgeon to give the word. The mourning period for Silas Vance was officially over. I no longer saw him as a father or a hero who had lost his way. I saw him as a patient with a terminal infection of the soul, and I was the one who was going to perform the autopsy. The audit wasn't just going to be about the $40 million, it was going to be about the 26 years of lies, the systematic theft of my mother's dignity, and the federal crimes that were hidden in plain sight within the legacy folder. I spent the next hour cross-referencing the internal manifests with the public SEC filings I could access through the hospital's high-speed VPN. The numbers were off by nearly 15% every single year, a discrepancy that amounted to tens of millions of dollars in unpaid federal taxes and penalties. If I brought this to the right people at the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, the Sterling Global shipping empire wouldn't just be fined, it would be dismantled brick by brick. Eleanor would lose her Lake Forest mansion, her Harry Winston diamonds, and her social standing. Hunter, the heir apparent, would find himself inheriting nothing but a mountain of legal fees and a prison sentence for his involvement in the shell corporations he had so proudly signed for in the lawyer's office. They thought they were liquidating me, but they were actually handing me the detonator to their entire world. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a worn notebook and a cheap ballpoint pen, my hands steady as I began to outline the timeline of the Sterling Vance fraud, starting with that October day in 1998 and ending with the funeral at St. Jude's. The technical specifications of their downfall were all right here, tucked away in folders labeled with mundane titles like Q3 maintenance and fuel surcharges. It was a masterpiece of hiding things in the most boring places possible. I could see the exact moment when my father had stopped being a man who loved his family and started being a man who loved his ledger more. He had traded the real, breathing love of a woman who worked in a warehouse for the cold, calculated approval of a woman who viewed him as a tax deduction. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard as it turned to 5 a.m., the first hints of a gray, dismal dawn beginning to break through the clouds. I wasn't just a trauma nurse anymore. I was a whistleblower, a guardian of the truth that my mother had died, metaphorically, on that marble floor, to protect. The Sterlings had the wealth, they had the pedigree, and they had the lawyers, but I had the data, and in the modern world, data is the only currency that never devalues. I closed my laptop with a definitive click, the sound echoing in the small cabin of the car like a gunshot. The audit was beginning, and I wouldn't stop until every cent was accounted for and every lie was exposed to the harsh light of the federal government. I put the car in gear, the engine of the Civic humming with a modest but honest power, and I drove out of the parking lot, leaving the shadow of the Sterling world behind me for now. I had a shift at the hospital starting in 2 hours, a 12-hour rotation in the ER where I would see people struggling for their lives, people who had nothing but their integrity left. They were my people. The Sterlings were just a ghost story I was about to stop telling. As I merged onto the Kennedy Expressway, the city of Chicago rising up around me like a forest of steel and glass, I felt a sense of purpose that no inheritance could ever provide. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who don't lie to you about who they are. And the Sterlings were about to find out exactly who Cassandra Vance was and what happens when you try to bury a woman who knows exactly where all the bodies are hidden. The weight of the student debt and the meager savings account didn't feel like a burden anymore. They felt like armor. I had nothing left to lose, which meant I was the most dangerous person in Eleanor Sterling's orbit. I thought about the smell of the lilies at the funeral and the spicy scent of the Tom Ford perfume. And I realized that soon, the only thing Eleanor would be smelling is the stale air of a deposition room and the metallic tang of fear. The storm was no longer just coming. I was the storm, and I was headed straight for the heart of the Sterling Empire with a ledger that didn't know how to lie. The audit wasn't just a financial process. It was my reclamation of the Vance name, a name that my mother had built with her own 2 hands and that I would now protect with everything I had. The real winners weren't the ones who kissed the hand of the oppressor. The real winners were the ones who stayed awake in the rain at 4:12 a.m. and chose to fight back when the world told them they had already lost. I stood in the center of a small, cramped pawn shop on the edge of the International District in Seattle, the smell of damp wool and old metal pressing in on me as I unbuckled the worn leather strap of the only real asset I had left in this world. It was a vintage 1964 Breitling Navi timer, a masterpiece of horological engineering that my grandfather had given me on the day I got into nursing school, telling me that a woman who saves lives needs to know exactly how much time she has left. The watch was worth more than my car, a timeless piece of steel and history that represented the only part of the Vance legacy that hadn't been tainted by my father's greed or Eleanor's cold-blooded calculations. The shop owner, a man whose eyes were as sharp and cynical as a vulture's, offered me $4,500 in cash, a fraction of its true market value, but exactly the amount I needed to cross the threshold of a different kind of sanctuary. I took the money, the weight of the $100 bills feeling like lead in my pocket, and I didn't look back as I walked out into the biting Seattle wind, heading toward the monolith of glass and cold steel that housed the offices of Pierce and Thorne. They were known throughout the Pacific Northwest as the most aggressive forensic auditors in the business, a firm that didn't just find missing money but hunted it down with a predatory efficiency that made even the most seasoned corporate criminals tremble. The Pierce and Thorne office felt less like a place of business and more like a high-tech surgical theater, smelling of expensive medical-grade sanitizer and the ozone of high-powered servers humming behind frosted glass walls. I sat across from Julian Thorne, a man whose suit probably cost more than my entire nursing residency, and whose intellect was as sharp as a diamond-tipped drill bit. I handed him the encrypted drive containing the legacy folder, the digital ghost of my mother's 32 years of silent observation, and watched as his team of analysts began to dismantle the Sterling Vance empire piece by digital piece. We spent the next 72 hours submerged in a sea of 15,000 pages of digital records, cross-referencing shipping manifests, fuel receipts, and port authority logs until my eyes burned and the taste of bitter, over-extracted espresso was all I knew. It was a descent into a financial underworld that my father had built with the meticulous care of a master architect, a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to make the Vance Freight Group appear like a struggling mid-sized operation, while it was actually a conduit for a staggering amount of untaxed wealth. The breakthrough came at 3:14 a.m. on the third day, when a junior auditor flagged a series of recurring maintenance fees for a fleet of vessels that didn't appear on any of the official Sterling Global Registry lists. We found them hidden in a subdirectory encrypted with a password that was my mother's birthday, a final mocking detail from a father who clearly thought he was untouchable. We called it the Ghost Fleet, a collection of 12 massive cargo ships registered in Panama under a shell corporation called Aurora Maritime Holdings. These weren't just ships. They were floating laundromats utilized by Eleanor and my father to wash approximately $8.4 million in untaxed revenue over the last decade alone. I watched the GPS pings on Thorne's massive wall-mounted monitors, tracing the movement of these phantom vessels as they moved through international waters, docking at private terminals where the cargo was never officially declared, and the profits were funneled into secret bank routing numbers in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. It was a systematic, multi-million-dollar tax evasion scheme that transformed the Sterlings from mere socialites into high-level federal criminals, and I had every single coordinate and transaction ID burned onto a secure server. But the most devastating discovery wasn't the money. It was the proof of the original sin that had started this entire nightmare. Tucked away in a folder labeled Private Legal 1998, we found the high-resolution scans of the original divorce papers that Eleanor had brandished in the lawyer's office like a death warrant. Thorne ran a forensic signature analysis on the documents, comparing them to my mother's actual handwriting from her warehouse logs and my father's corporate filings. The results were undeniable and sickening. My mother's signature on those 1998 papers had been forged with a sophisticated autopen system, a digital recreation of her handwriting that was perfect to the naked eye but lacked the natural pressure variations of a human hand. My father and Eleanor hadn't just legally dissolved the marriage. They had committed identity theft and legal fraud to create a revisionist history that stripped my mother of her rights before I was even in kindergarten. They had lived a 26-year lie, built on a foundation of forged ink and stolen dignity, and they had done it all while my mother was working herself to the bone in the Anchorage warehouse to keep their legitimate business afloat. The technical specifications of their downfall were now laid out before me in a series of undeniable, cold-blooded charts and graphs. I had the routing numbers for the offshore accounts, the specific dates of the forged signatures, and the exact tonnage of the Ghost Fleet's illegal cargo. Pierce and Thorne had mapped out the entire anatomy of the Sterling fraud, from the $400 Tom Ford perfume Eleanor wore to the $6,000 Chanel suits she bought with money that legally belonged to the federal government and my mother. The $8.4 million was just the tip of the iceberg, a baseline figure that would likely triple once the IRS began their own investigation and added the penalties and interest dating back to the late 90s. I felt a surge of adrenaline that was more powerful than any drug, a clarity of purpose that made the exhaustion of the last few days vanish. I wasn't just a daughter looking for an inheritance anymore. I was the primary witness in a federal racketeering case that would dismantle everything the Sterlings held dear. The office of Pierce and Thorne was silent as the final report was compiled. The only sound, the soft clicking of keyboards and the distant hum of the city traffic 60 floors below. Julian Thorne looked at me with a rare expression of genuine respect, his usual mask of professional detachment slipping for just a moment. "You realize that once we hand this to the Department of Justice, there is no going back," he said, his voice low and resonant in the sterile room. "They will come for everyone involved, and they will move with a speed that will leave the Sterling legal team breathless." I looked at the digital display of the Ghost Fleet's last known positions and thought about my mother, broken and humiliated on that marble floor in Chicago, and I thought about the vintage Breitling watch that was now sitting in a dusty display case in a pawn shop. I had traded a piece of my history to buy the tools for their destruction, and it was the best bargain I had ever made. I told him to proceed, to send the files directly to the lead prosecutor at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, a man Thorne knew personally who specialized in dismantling offshore tax havens. As the progress bar on the screen reached 100%, signifying the transfer of the 15,000 pages of evidence, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had been carrying since the day of my father's funeral. The Sterlings thought they were playing a game of social standing and legal maneuvering, but I had changed the rules to a game of survival and federal statutes. They had the $40 million estate and the Porsche Taycans and the Harry Winston diamonds, but I had the truth, and the truth was currently traveling at the speed of light toward a federal grand jury. Eleanor Sterling was about to find out that no amount of old money could protect her from the cold, hard reality of a forensic audit. And my brother Hunter would soon learn that being a real winner usually involves not signing your name to federal documents involving money laundering. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, a city built on the grit of people who actually worked for their fortunes, and I felt a sense of peace that no amount of money could ever buy. The audit was no longer just a process of counting numbers. It was a process of reclamation. I was reclaiming my mother's 32 years of labor, my own right to a future that wasn't dictated by a forged document, and the Vance name itself from the mud the Sterlings had dragged it through. Pierce and Thorne had provided the scalpel, and I was the one who had made the first incision. The Sterling global empire was hemorrhaging, and there was no trauma nurse in the world who could stop the bleeding I had just started. I thought about the smell of the warehouse in Alaska, the cedar and the cold air and the sound of the cranes, and I realized that the real legacy wasn't the money or the ships. It was the resilience that my mother had passed down to me, a strength that was forged in the shadows of an empire that had tried to erase her. Eleanor Sterling had called me a tax deduction, but she was about to learn that I was the highest interest debt she had ever incurred, and the bill was finally due in full. I left the glass and steel tower of Pierce and Thorne at 5:30 a.m., the first light of dawn reflecting off the skyscraper windows like a promise. I had $0 in my savings account now, and my wrist felt light and empty without my grandfather's watch, but I had never felt more powerful. I walked toward the nearest bus stop, my sensible nursing shoes clicking against the pavement, a silent warrior in a black coat who had just decapitated a kingdom. The Ghost Fleet was finally coming home to roost, and when it did, the Sterlings would find that the water was much deeper and colder than they had ever imagined. Family isn't the people who share your bank account or your forged legal documents. Family is the people whose labor you respect and whose truth you protect, even when it costs you everything. I was a Vance, and for the first time in 26 years, that name meant exactly what it was supposed to: integrity, endurance, and the courage to burn down a lie to save the truth. The audit was complete, the evidence was in flight, and the reckoning for Eleanor Sterling was only just beginning. Eleanor Sterling had always possessed a flair for the theatrical, a talent for turning a cold-blooded corporate takeover into a high-society performance, and the rebranding gala she hosted at our custom Cedar Lodge in Anchorage was her magnum opus of arrogance. She had invited 120 of Alaska's most powerful elite, from oil magnates in charcoal brioni suits to state senators and logistics titans, all gathered to witness the official burial of my mother's legacy and the coronation of the new Sterling Vance partnership. The logistics of the evening were staggering in their excess. A deliberate display of the $40 million estate she had stolen with a forged signature and a cold smile. The catering alone had cost a documented $25,000, featuring silver platters of beluga caviar served on mother-of-pearl spoons and bite-sized portions of A5 Japanese Wagyu beef that smelled of rich fat and rosemary, prepared by a team of chefs she had flown in from Seattle specifically for the event. The great room of the lodge, usually filled with the honest scent of cedar and wood smoke, was now suffocatingly expensive, saturated with the cloying aroma of $500 per ounce perfumes and the sharp, metallic tang of chilled Bollinger champagne flowing from a custom-carved ice sculpture in the shape of a Sterling freight ship. As the grandfather clock in the foyer struck 9 p.m., the heavy cedar doors creaked open against the 15-degree Alaskan night, admitting a blast of Arctic air that briefly cut through the stifling heat of the gala. I stepped into the light, not as the grieving daughter or the trailer park trash Eleanor had labeled me, but as the inevitable consequence of her own crimes. I was wearing a simple, sharp black dress I had purchased for $200 at a boutique in downtown Seattle, a garment that felt like armor against the sea of $15,000 gowns swirling around me. I didn't have a designer clutch or a pair of Jimmy Choos. Instead, I carried a single, high-capacity USB drive tucked into my palm and a stack of manila folders that contained the quantified destruction of the Sterling name. My presence was an immediate glitch in her perfectly curated program. A silent, dark silhouette standing amidst the gold leaf and the flickering candlelight of the lodge my mother had built with her own blood and sweat. Eleanor was standing near the massive stone fireplace, the center of a sycophantic circle, draped in a midnight blue velvet gown that shimmered with the calculated light of a woman who owned the world. But it was the piece around her neck that made my vision blur with a momentary white-hot fury. She was wearing a $150,000 diamond necklace, a sprawling Victorian-era masterpiece of platinum and pear-cut stones that had belonged to my grandmother, Miriam's mother. It was supposed to be my inheritance, a piece of family history that my mother had tucked away for my wedding day. Yet there it sat against the cold, surgically tightened skin of the woman who had helped my father commit 26 years of federal tax fraud. The diamonds caught the firelight, casting sharp, jagged reflections across the room, mocking the very idea of justice. Beside her stood Hunter, looking flushed and bloated from too much expensive scotch, laughing at a joke made by a port commissioner while surreptitiously checking his reflection in a nearby silver tray. I moved through the crowd with the clinical precision of a nurse navigating a chaotic trauma bay, my gaze fixed entirely on the woman at the center of the room. The murmurs began almost instantly, a low-frequency hum of recognition and scandal that rippled through the guests as they realized exactly who had just walked in without an invitation. I could see the technical specifications of their discomfort, the way the state senator adjusted his silk tie, the way the bank executives suddenly found deep interest in their champagne flutes, and the way Eleanor's eyes narrowed into slits of frozen sapphire as I approached. She didn't move, her posture rigid as a statue, her hand coming up instinctively to touch the stolen diamonds at her throat. "Cassandra," she said, her voice a low, dangerous purr that barely carried over the soft jazz quartet playing in the corner. "I thought we had reached an understanding in Chicago. This is a private event for the stakeholders of the future, not a charity ward for the displaced." I didn't answer her immediately. Instead, I reached out and placed the stack of manila folders directly onto a nearby catering table, right next to a silver bowl of melting ice and $20 worth of discarded caviar. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was surprisingly loud in the sudden silence that had descended over our corner of the lodge. "I'm not here for charity, Eleanor," I said, my voice steady and resonant, honed by years of calling out orders over the roar of hospital machinery. "I'm here as the primary witness for the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division." I looked at Hunter, whose smirk was slowly dissolving into a mask of pale, sweating confusion. "I hope you enjoyed the Wagyu, Hunter, because according to the Ghost Fleet manifests I found in Dad's private ledger, you signed off on $3.2 million in fraudulent maintenance write-offs last year alone. That's not just a social gaffe, that's a felony with a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 40 degrees in an instant. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket and held it up, the small piece of plastic and metal glowing under the chandeliers. "This contains the GPS pings of 12 cargo ships that don't exist on your official tax returns," I continued, my voice gaining strength as the elite of Anchorage leaned in to catch every word of the sterling collapse. "It contains the routing numbers for the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands where you've been washing $8.4 million in untaxed revenue. And most importantly, Eleanor, it contains the forensic handwriting analysis of the 1998 divorce papers. We know about the autopen. We know the signature was forged, which means legally, my mother is still the co-owner of every single asset in this room, including the lodge you're currently trespassing in and the necklace you've stolen from my family's neck." Eleanor's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray, the $60,000 facelift unable to mask the sheer animal terror that was beginning to bleed through her aristocratic facade. She tried to signal for security, her hand trembling as she gestured toward the 2 men in black suits standing by the foyer. But I didn't flinch. "You can have them throw me out, Eleanor, but you can't throw out the digital transmission that was sent to the Department of Justice 3 hours ago," I said, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive Tom Ford perfume that had once felt like an assault and now just smelled like the scent of a sinking ship. "The audit isn't coming. The audit is already here. The federal agents are likely at your Lake Forest estate and your Chicago offices as we speak. I just wanted to be here to see the look on your face when you realized that the trailer park trash was the one who finally balanced your books." The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that stretched across the 7,500-square-foot lodge. The elite of Alaska, the real winners Hunter had been so eager to join, began to slowly back away from the Sterlings as if they were suddenly contaminated. I watched as a prominent judge quietly set down his drink and headed for the coat closet, followed closely by the very port commissioner Hunter had been trying to impress moments ago. The rebranding gala was turning into a crime scene in real time, the $25,000 catering and the $150,000 necklace becoming nothing more than evidence of a grand, decades-long deception. Hunter reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen, probably trying to call the $3,000 an hour attorneys who were about to become very, very busy. But I could see the realization in his eyes that no amount of money could fix a forged signature on a federal document. I stood my ground, my $200 dress feeling more powerful than any Chanel suit in existence. I looked around the room, at the cedar beams my mother had selected, at the floor she had scrubbed, and at the life she had been cheated out of for 26 years. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a reclamation of her existence. The Sterlings had tried to turn us into a footnote, a tax deduction, a mistake to be erased, but they had forgotten that the people who work in the shadows see everything. I had spent my life as a nurse being overlooked by people like Eleanor, but in the trauma of this moment, I was the only one who knew how to handle the truth. As the first distant sirens began to wail through the cold Alaskan night, their blue and red lights reflecting off the snow outside the lodge windows, I felt a deep ancestral peace settle into my bones. Family isn't the name you inherit or the money you steal. Family is the truth you carry when everyone else is lying. The Ghost Fleet was finally docked, the ledger was closed, and for the first time in my life, The Vance name belonged to the people who had actually earned it. I turned my back on Eleanor Sterling and the crumbling ruins of her empire, walking out of the lodge and into the clean, freezing air of the night, leaving the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and lies behind me forever. I did not come to the Vance Lodge to make a scene or to engage in the kind of hysterical public meltdown that Eleanor Sterling expected from people she considered beneath her. Instead, I came to deliver a meticulously curated clinical presentation of a corporate autopsy. The great room was buzzing with the low, expensive hum of Anchorage's elite, their voices clinking like the ice in their crystal tumblers, all of them gathered to watch a $20,000 projection screen that had been set up to display a glossy, revisionist company history video meant to sanctify the Sterling takeover. As the lights dimmed and the first chords of an inspiring orchestral soundtrack began to swell through the hidden Bose surround sound speakers, I moved with the practiced, invisible efficiency of a nurse in a high-stakes trauma bay toward the tech booth hidden behind a cedar partition. The young technician, a local freelancer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, didn't even question me when I handed him my encrypted USB drive with the authority of someone who belonged there, and within 3 seconds, I had hijacked the digital feed. The soaring images of freight ships and sunsets were abruptly severed, replaced not by a grainy home movie, but by the high-resolution, cold-blooded reality of the Panamanian bank statements and the side-by-side forensic signatures of the forged 1998 divorce documents that had been the foundation of Eleanor's lie. The transition was violent in its silence, the $20,000 screen now acting as a giant glowing billboard for the $8.4 million tax evasion scheme we had unearthed in the glass offices of Pierce and Thorne. I stepped out from behind the partition and into the center of the room, the flickering blue light of the projector casting long, skeletal shadows across the vaulted cedar ceiling as I began to move through the front row of the audience. I didn't wait for permission. I began handing out the thick manila folders I had been carrying, placing them directly into the hands of the 3 city council members who were sitting in the VIP section, men who had just minutes ago been laughing with Hunter about new zoning permits. I watched their faces change in the reflected glow of the screen, the initial confusion giving way to a sharp, professional horror as they looked at the secret routing numbers and the GPS pings of the ghost fleet that didn't exist on any federal tax return. The atmosphere in the lodge transformed instantly, the air becoming so still and the silence so absolute that you could actually hear the ice melting in the abandoned drinks and the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Eleanor Sterling, who had been the picture of aristocratic poise just moments before, saw her entire world disintegrate in the span of a few heartbeats, her face turning a sickly, translucent color that reminded me of spoiled milk left out in the sun. The $150,000 diamond necklace at her throat seemed to grow heavy, the stones catching the light of the incriminating bank statements projected behind her and casting jagged, fractured patterns across her trembling hands. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out of her throat as she stared at the side-by-side comparison of my mother's real signature and the mechanical autopen forgery she had used to steal our life. The technical specifications of her downfall were now public property, broadcast to the very people she relied on for social and political cover, and there was no amount of Chanel tweed or Tom Ford perfume that could mask the sudden, pungent scent of a federal investigation. Beside her, Hunter snapped out of his drunken stupor, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson as he realized that the real winners he had joined were currently flatlining in front of the entire city. He lunged toward me with a clumsy, panicked desperation, his hand reaching out to snatch the folders from the city council members, his eyes wide with the frantic energy of a man who sees the prison bars closing in real time. I didn't flinch. I simply stepped back, the movement fluid and calculated, and looked him directly in the eye with a coldness that froze him in his tracks. "Don't touch that evidence, Hunter," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel through skin, loud enough for every guest in the room to hear. "It is a felony to tamper with documents involved in an active federal audit, and as an officer of the Sterling Vance partnership, you're already looking at a racketeering charge that carries a 20-year maximum." The word felony seemed to echo against the hand-hewn logs of the lodge, a final, definitive sentence that stripped away his bespoke suit and his unearned confidence, leaving him standing there looking like the terrified, hollow boy he had always been. I watched as the city council members swapped looks of grim realization, their hands tightening on the manila folders as if they were holding onto a life raft in a sinking ship. They were politicians, and they knew exactly how quickly a campaign donor becomes a liability once the IRS Criminal Investigation Division is mentioned. One by one, the elite guests began to set their champagne flutes down on the tables, the soft clinks sounding like hammers hitting nails. I could see the internal calculations happening behind their eyes, the distancing, the strategic withdrawal, the total abandonment of the Sterling name. The room, which had been a temple to Eleanor's ego only 10 minutes ago, was now a courtroom where she was the only one on trial. The $25,000 catering, the Wagyu beef, and the beluga caviar sat untouched and rotting in the heat of the room, a perfect metaphor for the fortune they had built on the back of my mother's stolen 32 years. I turned my gaze back to the screen, where the scrolling list of the Ghost Fleet's cargo was still being displayed. Thousands of tons of heavy machinery and untaxed freight that had been moved through the port of Anchorage under the cover of night. Every line of data was a nail in the coffin of my father's visionary legacy. I thought about my mother, who was currently resting in a quiet apartment I had rented for her with the last of my savings, and I felt a surge of something more powerful than revenge. It was justice, measured in routing numbers and forensic signatures. Eleanor finally found her voice, but it was thin and reedy, stripped of its silk-lined authority. "This is a fabrication," she hissed, her eyes darting around the room for an ally that no longer existed. "You are a bitter, vengeful girl who has nothing." But even as she spoke, the projector transitioned to a scan of a private email exchange between her and my father from 2002, discussing the offshore contingency and the need to keep the Indiana woman out of the loop permanently. The proof was undeniable, a digital confession projected in 10-foot-tall letters for everyone to see. The technicians in the back, realizing the magnitude of what was happening, didn't try to shut the feed down. They simply stood there and watched, captivated by the public execution of a dynasty. I saw the port commissioner, a man who had accepted dozens of private flights on Vance freight planes, quietly slip out the side door, followed by a wave of other guests who were suddenly eager to be anywhere else. The rebranding gala had been intended to announce the birth of a new empire, but instead, it was the recorded time of death for the Sterling Global brand. I felt the weight of the USB drive in my hand, the digital heart of the Vance family's true history, and I realized that I had done exactly what my grandfather's Breitling watch was meant for. I had used my time to save what mattered. Family isn't the people who share your blood and then sell you out for a tax deduction. Family is the person who keeps the logs, who remembers the truth, and who stays in the room to make sure the debt is paid. Eleanor Sterling had billions of dollars, but she was currently the poorest person in the lodge, stripped of her dignity, her reputation, and her future. Hunter was still standing there, his hand frozen mid-air, looking at the folders as if they were live grenades, which, in a legal sense, they were. The silence in the room was no longer just about the shock. It was the silence of a vacuum created by the sudden collapse of a massive power structure. As the blue light from the projector continued to pulse against the cedar walls, I felt a sense of peace that no amount of inheritance could ever provide. I had walked into this house as a ghost, but I was leaving it as the only real person left in the Vance legacy. I looked at the diamond necklace one last time, the $150,000 of stolen history around Eleanor's neck, and I knew that within 48 hours, it would be bagged as evidence in a federal asset forfeiture. I didn't need to rip it off her. The law would do that for me. I began to walk toward the exit, the crowd parting before me as if I were a force of nature, which perhaps I was. I had performed the surgery, I had removed the infection, and now I was leaving the patient to the consequences of their own choices. The 15-degree air outside was waiting for me, clean and sharp and honest, and for the first time in 24 years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. The audit was over, the presentation was complete, and the Sterlings were about to find out that when you build a house on forged signatures and ghost ships, you shouldn't be surprised when the whole thing burns down under the weight of the truth. I stepped out onto the porch of the lodge my mother built, the sound of my own footsteps the only thing I needed to hear, leaving the color of spoiled milk and the smell of melting ice behind me forever. The aftermath of that night at the Vance Lodge was not merely a social scandal. It was a swift and calculated financial bloodbath that dismantled the Sterling Vance empire with the terrifying efficiency of a controlled demolition. Once the evidence from my hijacked presentation was corroborated by the forensic data from Pierce and Thorne, the internal machinery of the federal government moved with a speed that left the high-priced Sterling legal team absolutely breathless. Within exactly 11 days of the gala, the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, backed by a phalanx of federal marshals, executed a series of seizure warrants that effectively froze every asset associated with the Sterling name, from the Lake Forest mansion in Illinois to the very cedar logs of the Alaskan lodge I had grown up in. I watched from a distance as the yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the mahogany doors, a visual representation of the end of a dynasty built on a foundation of forged signatures and ghost ships. Eleanor Sterling, the woman who had once stood in a $6,200 Chanel suit and called me a tax deduction, found herself stripped of her Harry Winston diamonds and her social standing faster than she could dial her lead attorney's private line. She was indicted on 28 counts of federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit identity theft, and after a trial that exposed the sickening depth of her 26-year deception, she was sentenced to 7 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. The woman who once spent $400 on a single bottle of Tom Ford perfume now wears a standardized tan jumpsuit and lives in a world where her worth is measured by the length of her sentence rather than the size of her stock portfolio. The technical specifications of the Sterling collapse were documented in a 300-page final report by the Department of Justice, a document that I keep in a fireproof safe as a testament to the power of the truth. My brother Hunter, the supposed heir apparent who had so eagerly kissed Eleanor's hand in a bid for power, saw his entire projected inheritance incinerated in the heat of the back taxes and penalties that the IRS levied against the estate. Because he had signed his name to the fraudulent maintenance logs of the Ghost Fleet, he was held personally liable for a portion of the restitution, a financial burden that wiped out his trust fund and left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation that was radioactive in any corporate setting. The man who used to crash $90,000 Porsche Taycans and charge $5,000 dinners to a company card is now living in a drafty studio apartment in a dilapidated section of Anchorage, working a grueling night shift at a local salmon cannery. He spends his hours in a cold, damp warehouse that smells of brine and industrial scale removers, earning exactly $16 an hour, a wage that barely covers his rent and the bus pass he now relies on. I sometimes think about him standing there, his hands cold and smelling of fish, realizing too late that being a real winner requires a level of integrity he was never willing to develop. As for my mother and me, the reclamation of our lives didn't come from the Sterling estate itself, which was almost entirely consumed by the federal government's thirst for unpaid revenue, but from the very system that Eleanor had tried to weaponize against us. Because the information I provided led to the recovery of tens of millions of dollars in unpaid taxes, I was eligible for a whistleblower reward from the IRS whistleblower office. 6 months after the final convictions were handed down, a check arrived in the mail for exactly $1,200,000, a sum that represented the quantified value of my persistence and my refusal to be erased. With that money, I didn't buy a Porsche or a Chanel suit. Instead, I bought a quiet, sun-drenched condo in Scottsdale, Arizona, a place where the air is dry and the light is always gold, far away from the frozen lies of Alaska and the marble-clad treachery of Chicago. The condo features a small, professional-grade kitchen for my mother and a balcony where we can sit and watch the sunset over the desert without the suffocating scent of stolen perfume or the weight of a forged history. My mother, Miriam, finally has the peace she earned through 32 years of backbreaking labor. She spends her mornings gardening and her afternoons reading books she never had the time to finish when she was keeping the Vance Freight Group afloat. The transition from a high-stakes trauma nurse in the gray corridors of Northwestern Memorial to a woman living in the quiet warmth of the Southwest was not just a change of scenery, but a profound internal recalibration. I still work as a nurse, though now I choose my shifts at a specialized surgical center where I can focus on the healing process rather than the immediate chaos of the ER. I carry the same sense of clinical observation with me, but it is no longer fueled by the desperate need to survive a family of predators. The $1,200,000 provided us with a foundation of security that no sterling could ever touch, a financial independence that was earned through the cold, hard truth rather than the manipulation of a ledger. I often look at my wrist, which remains bare after selling my grandfather's Breitling to fund the audit, and I realize that I don't need a vintage watch to tell me what time it is. I know exactly what time it is. It is the era of the Vance women, a time defined by our own standards and our own resilience. Living in Scottsdale, surrounded by the quiet hum of the desert and the scent of sagebrush, I have had plenty of time to reflect on the nature of family and the cost of loyalty. I realized that the Sterlings and even my father Silas didn't just steal money. They tried to steal our sense of reality, forcing us to live in a world where our work was invisible and our presence was a mistake. Breaking that cycle required a level of surgical precision that most people are unwilling to apply to their own blood. But in the end, the truth is the only thing that doesn't rot under pressure. Eleanor is currently sitting in a cell in Dublin, perhaps reflecting on the tax deduction she thought I was, while I am standing in a kitchen that smells of fresh coffee and the promise of a future I built with my own 2 hands. The ghost fleet has been scrapped, the secret bank accounts have been emptied by the feds, and the forged divorce papers are now nothing more than a footnote in a criminal case file. Family isn't the name on a freight ship or the diamonds around a grandmother's neck. Family is the person who refuses to let a lie become the legacy. My mother and I have a relationship now that is built on the transparency we were denied for 26 years, a bond that is stronger than any corporate partnership or legal decree. We don't talk about the Sterlings often, but when we do, it is with the detached curiosity of surgeons discussing a successfully removed tumor. They were a malignancy in our lives, a growth fueled by greed and sustained by the silence of the people they underestimated. By choosing the cold, hard truth over a hollow family loyalty, I didn't just get a whistleblower reward, I got my mother's dignity back, and I secured a life where we never have to wonder if we belong at the table. As I sit on my balcony in Scottsdale, the temperature a perfect 75 degrees as the moon begins to rise over the McDowell Mountains, I think about the $16 an hour shift Hunter is currently starting in the cold Alaskan dark. I think about the 7 years Eleanor has left to serve behind a chain-link fence, and then I think about the simple, sharp black dress that is still hanging in my closet, a reminder of the night the presentation began and the lies ended. The audit of my life is complete. The figures have been balanced, and for the first time since I was a child in that cedar lodge, the debt has been paid in full. I am Cassandra Vance. I am a survivor of a different kind of slaughter, and I am finally, undeniably free. The truth didn't just set me free, it gave me the world, and I intend to live in it with every ounce of the integrity that the Sterlings were never able to buy.